I'm going to talk from a really sort of an economic and legal sort of framework. So these are the stakeholders who have an interest in translation, have an interest in science and the progress. Obviously companies and scientists, governments, funding agencies, but society as a whole. And I'm really going to argue that what we should be worrying about is optimizing the benefits for society and trying to make sure that these stakeholders who have vested interests, particularly some of them, don't corrupt things in their interest against the benefits of society. And there's this film, actually, anybody who's seen it, it's quite old now, The Corporation, and the premise of the film is a company is a legal individual. If you think of them as an individual, what sort of individual would they be? And the film basically goes through and concludes that a corporation is like basically a psychopath. I mean, basically, companies are about money, and even if you have really good people who have interests in helping those who can't afford drugs and things like that, that will only go so far because they are constructed around the premise of making money. So you have to have something to counter that. So that's the point. So I'm going to go through a few scenarios of where we are in this, framed around this sort of layout. So you've got scientists, the black is the money, that's the information. So scientists feed back information on themselves, that's the progress of science. The criticism of 25 years ago was there wasn't really very much connection here between the scientists and the companies. There wasn't much translation going on. And so something needs to be done about that. Well, you can just try and improve that information flow. But the problem is that you end up, if you're not careful, ending up with things like this, where information flows to the companies, but then it's kind of locked, and those exclusive rights, as the previous speaker talked about, get in the way of the information flow, get in the way of the follow-on innovation, in the form of restrictions linked to intellectual property, linked to secrecy, etc., etc. Now that might produce better flows of money in terms of taxation from companies to government, which may feed back into funding agency and improve the amount of funding going into science. But equally, you can end up with something like this, where the companies start to bypass the flow of money, the sort of society's choice about what it wants to spend science, what it wants to spend money on science, and funding it directly, and that can shortcut and obviously, as the previous speaker said, change the priorities of what we do and kind of corrupt the process as a whole. So, from society's point of view, I would argue that this thing up here, this isn't really ideal because we do want to have some translation. We do want to make sure that things that get discovered turn into products that are good for us and good for society as a whole. But we don't want to end up with things like this too much, where we end up blocking the progress of science because of translation. So we'd like to end up with something like that. The question is, what can you do to kind of restrain these kind of things which we know go on? What can you do to facilitate this? So I'm going to show a few examples. So I think there are some examples. Now, there's the first one, which is possibly a slight corruption of things, but in fact, one aspect of translation is publishing, getting the information out to a broad community, including the general public and including people who are going to build new stuff on it. And that's also been a restricted model up to until recently. You have the publication, the manuscripts going to publishers, but then they put access controls on this, you can't all read this, you have to subscribe. But in terms of a business model, this has been funded by funding agencies and governments directly. And so because of this structure of this business model, it was possible for governments to suddenly realize at some point that actually it didn't have to be this way around, that they could change things. They could change the business model because they were the ones doing the paying and change it around like this. So now governments give money to funding agencies make conditions on science that they should publish in open publications. They give the extra money that they would have given to the libraries, and this goes to pay, author pays manuscripts, and now suddenly the publishers don't charge subscriptions for these articles, anybody can read them. So this is a change in business model, facilitated by the fact that there was enough evidence collected, it's again about doing research on research. The Wellcome Trust particularly paid for research to look at these different business models and conclude that this was a viable business model. So we're in a transition here, but there's a significant amount of publication that's changed around. So I would say this is a case where we've done something to the translation model, translation around publication, which has improved things quite significantly and is continuing. This is continuing. So now what about more serious stuff? Well, another example is just open data. This is another form of translation. One of the outputs of science is data. Particularly now there's more and more data being collected, and again you can build things on top of that. And if you have a proprietary model for that data release, restricted model where scientists only give it to certain people, and obviously gets in the way of translation by many groups. So what's happened is funding agencies have basically realized that this is a good model and started to make funding conditional on open access. And again, the scientists, when they release data to everybody, including companies, it goes through open access licenses to make sure that it stays in the public domain. And no matter what happens over here, it doesn't get in the way of this feedback loop around the data. And of course, the history of this is the Human Genome Project, other genome projects, pioneering, at least in biology, data release. And there's a lot of evidence that this had a big impact in terms of the science that came afterwards. This has influenced policymakers, funding agencies. It's changed the requirements now when you apply for grants. You have large consortium end up developing data sharing agreements. And this has been a sort of progress over since 2003, recently a meeting in 2008, development of data sharing policy at the NIH and the Wellcome Trust and places like that. So this has been a kind of evolving sort of story in terms of this being a good thing for science in general. There are things to address in this area because maybe what I didn't emphasize at the beginning is scientists also have problems in terms of not really being totally aligned with society, because scientists want to gain credit and they will try and monopolize data themselves and not be as open as they might because they think it will expose them to too much competition. But those attitudes are changing, partly because if your funders say you have to do it, you change your policy, your feeling somewhat. And we're also, I think, developing better ways to reward scientists who do share that data, finding ways of measuring that, finding metrics for allocating credit to people who do that. There are also more practical issues about just making it easier to reuse data. But basically, this data model